Hey guys, tonight we're headed into the chilly, damp heart of Northern Europe. Right around the year 1241, you're standing in the cold fog of Lübeck's harbor, where seagulls circle sluggishly and ropes creak on the massive cargo ships anchored side by side. There's a smell in the air, part seaweed, part smoked herring, and part something else, ambition, trade. The unmistakable scent of money quietly changing hands. You probably won't survive this, by the way, between pirate raids, freezing winters, and the absurd number of people who can legally fine you for stacking your barrels wrong. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're all listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off a worn wooden dock and onto the slick cobblestones of Lübeck, the queen of the Hanseatic League before the league even knew it had a queen. It's a damp morning, not rainy, not dry, just that specific kind of moist where your socks feel wrong for no logical reason. The Baltic Sea is just a few blocks away, though you can hear it more than you can see it. Distant thuds of barrels, clangs of metal, and curses in low German echo off the brick walls. This city wasn't always the grand merchant capital it became, originally founded by Slavs, and then burned to a crisp by some ambitious German nobles. Lübeck got a second life when Count Adolf II of Holstein decided it was a perfect spot to drop a bunch of new German settlers. Historians still argue whether this move was visionary or just convenient fire damage, but either way, Lübeck got a glow up. And here's the thing, location is everything. Lübeck sits where rivers meet the sea, an easy route inland and out to sea. Think of it like the medieval version of a pop-up Amazon distribution center. Except with more beer and fewer smiling boxes, the town became the link between the raw goods of the north, fur, timber, wax, and the finished goods of the south. Textiles, wine, spices, that meant everyone came through here. Germans, Danes, Swedes, Poles, and one guy from Italy who kept trying to pay in peppercorns. You know who you are. By the early 13th century, Lübeck wasn't just a city, it was the city, the model for what a merchant-run utopia could look like. No king breathing down your neck, no feudal lords demanding your grain harvest. Just a council of merchants drinking heavily and passing laws about how many sardines you could cram into a barrel. Fairly democratic, unless you were poor, female, or not a guild member. But hey, progress is slow. You stroll past red brick buildings, some with crooked windows and hand-carved signs swinging in the wind. Most buildings double as homes and shops, and if you peek through an open door, you'll probably see someone arguing about the moisture content of fish. That's not a joke. The Hanseatic League had laws about fish moisture. The dried cod trade was a high-stakes game. Now you might think, why Lübeck? Why not Hamburg or Riga? Or some other soggy place with too many boats? Well, Lübeck had the perfect mix of geography, guts, and gumption. And salt. Lots of salt. Salt was the medieval version of refrigeration. Without it, your food went bad fast, and not in the fun, fermenty kimchi way. More in the, oh no, this fish smells like a crime way. Salted fish, salted meat, salted everything. Lübeck had access to the massive salt mines of Lüneburg and a distribution network that could put it in anyone's soup bowl within weeks. But it wasn't just fish and salt. The League, once it formed, dealt in wool, wax, furs, timber, pitch, flax, grain, rye, and more herring than your dreams can handle. There were whole warehouses built just for rye. Imagine the drama of a rye shortage. Bakers whispering in back alleys, secret deals for moldy sacks. Hey, you got the goods? Yeah, but it's only medium rye. Scandalous. Here's the fringe fact of the night. The first major document linking Lübeck and Hamburg into a trade alliance? It's dated to 1241. That's basically the League's first baby photo. And what's in this historic pact? Essentially, don't rob each other, don't cheat each other, and if anyone else tries to rob us, we'll hit back together. Aw, medieval friendship bracelets. This little pact became a blueprint. Other towns wanted in. Rostock joined, then Wismar, then Riga, Reval, that's modern-day Tallinn, and eventually over 200 cities either officially or unofficially took part. It wasn't a country or a government or even a company. It was a network. A LinkedIn for the Middle Ages, but with more swords and fewer motivational quotes. And they were organized. The League would call official meetings called Hanseatic, where reps from various cities would gather, drink warm beer, argue about taxes, and sometimes vote on boycotts or wars. Historians still debate how much real power these meetings had, but the sheer fact that they happened and that some cities actually listened is a miracle in itself. Back to Lübeck. As the unofficial capital of the League, the city handled a lot of the big decisions. It sent letters, held the books, enforced embargoes, and occasionally hired mercenaries when things got spicy. There were official seals, wax stamps, guild masters, and so many documents. The Hanseatic obsession with paperwork is legendary. They even fine people for improperly filed complaints. Bureaucracy, now with extra parchment. And speaking of spice, yes, the League had spice routes. You'd think pepper and cinnamon would only pass through Venice or Alexandria, but Hanseatic ships moved them too, trading with southern cities or bartering through intermediaries. It's like your cousin's shady eBay store, but medieval. Some scholars argue the League had more influence in the spice trade than records show, but the evidence is patchy, possibly lost to time, fire, or a really clumsy scribe who knocked over an ink pot. Let's not forget pirates. Oh yes, pirates were a serious problem. Baltic pirates were less Jack Sparrow and more, I will set your boat on fire and steal your dog. The League dealt with them in very practical ways, convoys, armed ships, and paid naval escorts. Lübeck became a shipbuilding center. The design of their cogs, those wide, round-bottomed ships, was legendary, ugly, but sturdy. Like if a barge and a shoebox had a baby, still they floated, and that's more than can be said for half the competition. As you wander the harbor, imagine the soundscape. Ship bells, vendors shouting, gulls squawking, hammers pounding, waves slapping wood. Somewhere nearby, a priest mutters a blessing over a merchant's ledger, while a rat scurries underfoot, dragging a bit of dried bread. You're in the engine room of Northern Europe's economy, and no one knows just how big this engine is going to get. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just feel the fog. Let it curl around your ankles. Listen to the slow creak of ropes and the distant clang of a forge. The Hanseatic League is about to rise, and Lübeck is the match that lights the wick. You shuffle forward along the cobbled alleys of Lübeck, your boots a little damp from the morning dew and your senses overwhelmed by the heavy scent of tar, smoked meat, and something fishy, literally. The air has the salty bite of the sea and a faint hint of onions from someone's breakfast stew. Welcome to a world where breakfast is fish, lunch is fish, and dinner is probably also fish, unless you're rich, in which case it's salted meat and smoked superiority. Around you the city is buzzing, not in the electric hum of modern life, but in the clatter of horse carts, the hoarse barks of traders, and the scratch of quills on parchment. You've entered the heyday of early Hanseatic ambition, where the streets of Lübeck are alive with scheming merchants, protective monks, and yes, murderous tariffs. Seriously, people have died over wheat taxes, and not just in the metaphorical, oh, this tax is killing me sense. See, Europe in the 13th century is a messy sandbox. Kingdoms are everywhere, but coherent government? Not so much. Local lords control bridges and roads, and if you want to get your wagon from here to there, expect to pay a toll every 15 feet. Sometimes twice if the local duke had a bad breakfast. These tolls, called Zölle, were the bane of merchants everywhere. It was like playing Monopoly with a 3-year-old who charges you every time you pass a go. And no, you're not allowed to question it, so what do you do if you're a merchant in a wobbly feudal world? You unionize, medieval style. The early members of what would become the Hanseatic League realized that sticking together was their best bet against chaos. Cities like Lübeck and Hamburg decided to form pacts not just to trade, but to protect. one another from overreaching nobles, corrupt toll-keepers, and sea raiders who treated merchant ships like floating piñatas. This was the secret sauce: cooperation, but not the gentle kumbaya kind. This was practical, defensive, calculating cooperation. Think less. Teamwork makes the dream work, and more. If you mess with one of us, the rest will burn your dock. The League didn't emerge fully formed. It was a slow crawl from alliances between two cities to a sprawling network. Hamburg and Lübeck started it off, promising not to rob or cheat each other's merchants. Kind of a no funny business clause. Then they added clauses about shared defense, access to trade routes, and safe harbor guarantees. Eventually, other cities wanted in on this economic insurance plan. Because let's face it, trading was dangerous. One bad storm, one hungry pirate, or one tax-happy bishop could wipe out your entire livelihood. Here's a fun little fringe tidbit. Some cities joined the League only temporarily, like teenagers trying out a new clique. Others were full-time members for centuries. Some cities weren't even German. Places like Bergen in Norway and Novgorod in Russia joined the party too. The League wasn't about ethnicity or borders. It was about trade, profit, and security. If you had goods and wanted them protected, you were welcome. Unless you sold fake butter, then no one liked you. But the League wasn't all about commerce. Religion, strangely, had a hand in this too. Monasteries owned a ton of land and acted as regional banking centers. Monks weren't just praying and copying Bibles. They were lending money, storing goods, and occasionally running shipping operations. Some of the early merchant class were trained by monastic scribes. So yes, you might be buying your dried herring from someone who once debated theology in Latin. Now let's talk tariffs, the medieval version of death by 1,000 paper cuts. If you were moving cloth from Flanders to Poland, you might pay taxes in every duchy, county, bishopric, and random goat farm along the way. Every toll booth chipped away at your profits until you were just schlepping wool for fun. The League fought this with a mix of diplomatic pressure and flat-out threats. They'd negotiate special trade exemptions, form embargoes, or reroute entire supply lines to punish towns that taxed too hard. A town that annoyed the League might suddenly find itself skipped entirely by the trade caravans. Oops, there goes your economy. Historians still argue about how centralized the League really was. Some say it was a cohesive force with shared laws and coordinated policy. Others claim it was more like a group chat, full of strong opinions and ignored messages. The truth is somewhere in the middle. There was no supreme leader or standing army. Each city retained its autonomy, but there were shared codes, trusted messengers, and mutual interests. Like a co-op, but with more wool and fewer tofu options. A key tool in the League's arsenal? Embargo. If a king or city crossed them, they could declare a total trade freeze, essentially saying, fine, we won't sell you anything, and we'll tell everyone else not to either. This was shockingly effective in 1284, when Norway started taxing Hanseatic merchants unfairly. The League cut them off from the grain trade. Norway folded faster than you think. Turns out you can't live on salted fish alone, no matter how many onions you add. You pass a tavern now, its wooden sign swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, it's packed with loud voices, raised mugs, and the occasional heated debate over pepper prices. And here's something fun. Pepper was used as currency. That's right. Spices weren't just seasoning, they were economic assets. The phrase worth their weight in gold wasn't hyperbole. You could actually pay taxes in pepper, which frankly would make IRS audits way more fragrant. And then there were guilds, powerful collectives of artisans and merchants who set prices, regulated trade, and initiated new members with rules that bordered on the occult. You didn't just show up and start selling boots. You had to be a member, follow their rules, and occasionally go to very long, very boring meetings. But the perks were real. Protection, networking, and the ability to shout guild privilege in a crowded market. One particularly brutal moment in League history involved the infamous Stettin incident in the 14th century, where several Hanseatic merchants were imprisoned and had their goods confiscated after a tariff dispute. The League responded by organizing a full-scale boycott of the region. Trade collapsed, local leaders backpedaled, and the merchants were released. The message was clear: don't mess with the Hansa. And here's your open scholarly debate of the section. Did the League help foster early capitalism, or was it just a monopolistic cartel in medieval drag? Some scholars say the League's decentralized network, reliance on contracts, and use of credit systems laid the groundwork for modern trade. Others argue it was just a fancy protection racket. Less Wall Street, more Sopranos with boats. Back on the streets, the sun is finally breaking through the morning fog. Traders are setting up wooden stalls, laying out rolls of linen, sacks of rye, wax bricks, and strings of dried apples. A young apprentice struggles with a stubborn mule, and an older merchant yells at someone for stacking barrels in the wrong sequence. Everything smells faintly of leather and roasted turnips. You catch a snippet of a dispute in Low German. A language that sounds like Dutch and German got drunk together and decided to make up new grammar rules. Apparently someone shorted someone else on a load of fur pelts. Classic. As you move deeper into Lübeck's heart, it's clear that while kings squabbled and armies marched elsewhere in Europe, the real power here flowed through parchment, contracts, and coin. The Hanseatic League didn't conquer by sword, it conquered by invoice. The morning sun has finally broken through the fog in Lübeck, painting the rooftops a warm amber and making the puddles in the cobbled streets glimmer like little accidental mirrors. You hear the thick wooden gates of the warehouse district creak open with a heavy groan, and then, like a switch flipped, everything comes alive. Shouts, crates, horses protesting loudly, wagons lined with straw rolling in, but most importantly, fish. South much. Fish. Specifically, herring. You're about to enter the salty, slippery core of the Hanseatic economy. Welcome to the golden age of salted fish, the miracle protein that built cities, bribed kings, and made a bunch of guys in wool tunics very, very rich. It's hard to imagine today, but back in the 13th and 14th centuries, herring wasn't just a food, it was a religion. Well, sort of. With over 100 fast days on the Christian calendar, people weren't allowed to eat meat most of the year. That meant fish, especially fish that could be preserved, shipped, and sold year-round, was the medieval MVP. If you controlled the herring trade, you didn't just control dinner, you controlled society. And guess who figured that out early? The merchants of the Hanseatic League. You're standing now in one of Lübeck's massive fish warehouses, stone walls 3 feet thick, dark wood rafters above you, and rows of barrels stacked 5 high, each one sweating salt. A worker pries open a lid and gives a barrel a sniff, then nods in approval. Somewhere nearby, a scribe jots something down in a ledger the size of a medieval mattress. Seriously, this thing could stop a crossbow bolt. Let's talk about how this all worked. Herring were caught en masse in the North Sea and the Baltic, especially off the coast of Scania, now part of Sweden, but historically hotly contested. During the peak season, the sea was so full of herring that fishermen claimed they could scoop them with buckets. No net needed. Some of that may be exaggerated, but the scale of these catches was real and staggering. Entire fleets would set out, haul in tons of fish, and immediately begin the salting process right on the boat or back on shore. Salt, of course, was critical. It drew moisture from the fish, preserving it for the long journey inland. And where did much of that salt come from? You guessed it, Lüneburg. That sleepy little inland town sat on a giant underground salt dome. The white gold was mined, brined, and shipped in giant cones to Hanseatic cities, who then used it to cure millions of fish. Here's a deliciously weird fringe fact. In some Hanseatic cities, guilds actually had detailed laws on how to stack herring in barrels. If you got the layers wrong or didn't press the fish tight enough, your barrel could be rejected, your shipment could be fined, and your reputation could take a serious hit. No one wanted to be known as the guy who mucked the stack. Medieval shame was real. Now, don't think for a second this was just about fish. Herring was the anchor. Around it, the league built an entire trade ecosystem: shipyards, salt mines, storage facilities, customs offices, and docks that could handle the massive inflow and outflow of goods. Cities like Visby, Stralsund, and Greifswald became fish-handling machines. And with the fish came cloth, timber, wax, grain, copper, pitch, and resin. A ship that sailed north full of wool might return south crammed with salted fish and beeswax. You might think, wait, didn't people get bored of herring? I mean, it's fine, but it's not pizza. Yes, they did. But boredom was irrelevant. You ate what didn't kill you. And in an era where famine was always just a bad harvest away, herring was dependable, storable, and weirdly nutritious. Plus, when heavily salted and soaked in onions, anything tastes like dinner if you were hungry enough. Now here's a mainstream historical fact. The Hanseatic League didn't just trade fish, they regulated the entire process. Cities sent inspectors to herring markets. The League passed ordinances on weights, measures, barrel sizes, and salt purity. You couldn't just show up with a sack of fish and call yourself a trader. There were rules, elaborate, exhausting, exquisitely German rules. Some scholars argue the herring boom led to some of the earliest forms of quality control systems in European trade. Others think it was just obsessive micromanagement born of medieval anxiety. Either way, the paperwork was intense. You walk past a team of dock workers now loading a ship bound for Bergen. Each barrel is carefully numbered, sealed with wax, and rolled into the hold. The ship's captain, a weather-beaten man with a beard that could legally qualify as a thatched roof, waves you off as he climbs aboard. You'll see him again in a few months, hopefully with money and fewer teeth. Let's pause for another quirky sidebar. Did you know that the League's obsession with fish was so intense that they scheduled entire fairs around the herring season? The most famous was the Scania market, where merchants from all over Europe converged to buy, sell, argue, gamble, and occasionally get arrested for public drunkenness. Some towns even went bankrupt if the herring didn't show up. That's right, the fish had all the power. Back in Lübeck, you notice a younger apprentice scribbling figures on a slate board. While his master haggles over the price of flax, the boy's hands are ink-stained and his face is smudged, but he's watching closely. He's not just learning math, he's learning how to read people, how to undercut a rival, how to pretend your barrel is fresher than it actually is. Classic merchant training. And here's your scholarly debate of the evening. Was the League's success in the fish trade due to skill, luck, or sheer domination of supply chains? Some historians argue they were simply in the right place at the right time, riding the wave of church-imposed fasting and abundant fisheries. Others claim their organization, strategic outposts, and investment in logistics were the real key. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, with a lot of salted fish sloshing around on either side. You duck into a warehouse side room and find yourself surrounded by ledgers, stacks and stacks of them, bound in leather, tied with string, sealed with wax. Every sale, every shipment, every customer note is recorded with the precision of a nervous accountant. Some entries have marginal notes: buyer underpaid by 3 pfennigs, barrel found leaky, or, occasionally, avoid this man, he stinks of onions and deceit. And this wasn't just local. Lübeck had records for trade partners all over Europe: London, Bruges, Bergen, Novgorod, Gdansk. The League's network was a spider web, and the merchants in Lübeck were the spiders, sitting in the middle, feeling every vibration through their trade routes. Outside, a new shipment of salt arrives from the Elbe River. The cart creaks under the weight of the cones, massive lumps of crystalline sodium covered with cloth and sealed with pitch. The driver hops down, stretches his back, and starts shouting for help. Within minutes, barrels are opened, fresh fish are dumped in, salt is shoveled by the bucketful, and the preservation process begins all over again. And just like that, the economy churns on. It smells like fish. It runs on salt. And it might be the most boring, brilliant engine of trade the medieval world ever built. You leave the fishy echo of Lübeck's warehouses behind and step onto a rickety wooden cart, heading out toward the open road. You're bumping along a well-worn merchant route lined with gnarled trees and suspiciously curious cows. The road stretches ahead, muddy in places, dusty in others, and it's one of many arteries in a vast, pulsing network that connects the cities of the Hanseatic League. And tonight you're going to visit a few of the big names, the star trading hubs of medieval Europe: Bruges, Bergen, Novgorod, and maybe a few lesser known but equally delightful spots along the way. Don't worry, we'll go slow. It's bedtime after all. Your first stop? Bruges, the Diamond of Flanders. Imagine cobblestone streets that spiral like snail shells, canals that mirror the sky, and warehouses packed so tightly with textiles that the walls actually sweat. It's loud here. French, Dutch, and German all buzz through the streets like bees in a blender. Bruges was a textile powerhouse, and if you needed fine wool, you came here. The Hanseatic merchants didn't just visit, they embedded. They had their own quarters, their own rules, and their own church bells. Think embassy meets business campus. Foreign but familiar. Here's your historical fact. By the late 1200s, Bruges was the financial heart of Western Europe. Hanseatic merchants stationed here could access credit, buy luxury cloth and funnel goods inland through a spiderweb of canals. Bruges was Venice with more rain and fewer gondolas. One fringe fact? The Hanseatic compound in Bruges was so self-contained that it had its own jail. Yep. If you were a Hanse merchant and got caught cheating, lying, or, heaven forbid, shorting someone on pepper, you wouldn't go to the city jail. You'd go to your jail. Nothing says power like personalized imprisonment. Of course, Bruges had its tensions. Local merchants didn't always love the Hanse boys. They were rich, tight-lipped, and tended to marry among their own. There were occasional scuffles, sometimes more than scuffles, and Bruges City Council would occasionally clamp down, revoke privileges, or play politics. But the Hanse always found a way back in, usually through a clever bribe or an economic threat. You know, classic diplomacy. You leave Bruges behind and hitch a ride on a ship northward. It's a long, slow journey through mist-covered waters and temperamental weather. Eventually, you reach Bergen, Norway. And oh, what a change. Cold, windswept, and smelling faintly of fish, stew, and whale oil. Welcome to one of the Hanseatic League's most remote but important outposts. Bergen was the cod capital. Stockfish, dried, unsalted cod, was shipped out of here by the literal ton. The air here is crisp and heavy with the scent of ocean and pine. You step off the ship and immediately hear the low rumble of men unloading barrels, shouting orders in Norwegian and Low German, and the distinct sound of cod being smacked against something solid. It's surprisingly rhythmic. Here's your mainstream fact. Bergen was the hub for Hanseatic cod exports, particularly to Catholic Europe, where fish was basically mandatory on many days of the year. And since the Hanse controlled both the fishing and the distribution, they sat on a gold mine, a very smelly gold mine. But Bergen wasn't just about fish, it was also about power and cultural tension. Hanseatic merchants lived separately from locals, spoke their own language, and even had special legal privileges. If a Norwegian insulted a Hanseatic trader, there could be serious consequences. Imagine being a local baker and finding out you were fined for accidentally bumping into some German guy carrying wax. Awkward. Fringe tidbit time. Bergen's Hanseatic quarter, called the Briggen, was made almost entirely of wood. Despite the city catching fire roughly once a generation, you'd think after the third or fourth inferno someone would have suggested bricks. But no, fire insurance was basically pray and rebuild. You warm your fingers over a little iron stove in one of the merchant houses and glance through the frosty window at the port. Ships come and go, snow swirls above, and you wonder how many tons of fish have passed through the city. Probably enough to feed a continent, or to build it, really. Your next ride is east, far east, across the Baltic, through icy winds and thick fogs, into the strange and mysterious land of Novgorod, Russia. You arrive with frozen eyelashes and very few feeling toes, but the view is worth it. The city is vast, bigger than you expect. Wooden walls, onion-domed churches, muddy roads. But more importantly, fur. So much fur. Sable, ermine, fox, squirrel. Novgorod was the source of the warmest wealth in Europe. Here's your historical fact, the Hanseatic League's contour. That's a fancy word for trading office, and Novgorod was one of their most secure and isolated. Hanseatic traders weren't allowed to walk freely in the city. They lived in a gated compound, slept under curfew, and had to pass all messages through an official intermediary. Why? Because the Novgorodians didn't trust foreigners. And honestly, can you blame them? Here's a fringe fact to warm you up. In winter, traders stored documents by pressing them between blocks of frozen meat. They kept the ink from running and discouraged rats. Not exactly a filing cabinet, but hey, it worked. In Novgorod, the Hanseatic League didn't just trade goods, they traded intelligence. Spies operated in both directions, watching movements, reporting on supply lines, and occasionally slipping notes in barrels of wax. This was diplomacy with a fur hat on. You sip some questionable kvass, a fermented drink somewhere between beer and bread soup, and shiver as the wind whistles through the compound's palisades. It's clear the Hanseatic League was never just a coastal operation. It dug deep, stretched wide, and adapted to the weird and wild needs of every city it touched. Now you're back on the road, mentally at least, because between these major cities were dozens of smaller ones. Reval, now Tallinn, Danzig, now Dansk, Stralsund, Elbing, Wismar, Rostock. Each one a cog in the machine. They had their own specialties: timber, honey, pitch, amber, resin. Some dealt in grains, others in iron, a few in beeswax, so fine it was said to burn with a blue flame and no smoke. And just like that, you realize this league wasn't built on one product or one port. It was built on interconnection, a woven net, the kind that holds tight when pulled. Your scholarly debate tonight? Some historians argue the Hanseatic cities functioned as a proto-federation, an early attempt at economic unity across borders. Others insist it was pure pragmatism, a network of selfish cities working together only when it suited them. Were they brothers in trade, or just neighbors with similar problems? The truth probably flickers between the two, like candlelight on a ship's logbook. As you reach the end of this leg of the journey, the sun is setting over a quiet harbor in Tallinn. The wooden beams of a warehouse cast long shadows. Somewhere, a merchant tallies up a day's deals. A guard makes his rounds with a lantern. And you? You've seen it all. Fish barrels, fur pelts, flax sacks, bricks of wax, and the quiet, humming machinery of a trade network built not with swords, but with scales and signatures. You lie down on a bed of sackcloth in a rented room above a tavern, the faint scent of boiled cabbage in the air. A wooden beam creaks overhead. Outside, a dog barks once, then is silent. You smile. Even in the most boring of histories, there's something thrilling about a world held together by ships, salt, and the stubborn pursuit of profit. Your eyes blink open to the rhythmic sound of boots on stone. Not military boots. No, these are leather-soled, slightly uneven, the kind worn by men who walk more than they talk and spend most of their waking hours surrounded by ledgers, seals, and the constant threat of getting fined for using the wrong kind of wax stamp. You're in Lübeck again, but this time not in the warehouses or the docks. You're at the heart of the League's quiet empire, a dark-paneled meeting hall, lit by smoky lanterns and filled with murmurs, scowls, and the occasional dramatic sigh. The Hanseatic League is about to flex one of its most powerful muscles, bureaucracy. Today you're learning about rules, not the kind written by kings on grand scrolls, but the merchant-made laws that held the League together like overly complicated glue. Welcome to the world of trade codes, merchant courts, and guild punishments so specific they would make a modern HOA blush. Let's start simple. You're a merchant. You got a ship full of linen and beeswax. You've just landed in Danzig, and you need to unload your goods, get them stored, make a few trades, and be on your way. Easy, right? Not if you don't follow the Hanseatic rulebook to the letter. You had to declare your goods at a merchant office, pay import duties, which varied city to city. and then register your presence with the local Hanse Guild. No registration, no trading, no exceptions. If you sold goods before checking in, you could be fined or, worse, banned from the next city down the coast. They didn't mess around. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Hanseatic League operated by something called the Hanseatic Law, a collection of rules, privileges, and legal precedents that applied across the League's territories. These laws weren't national. They were merchant-made and enforced through contracts and mutual consent. In an age where kings and popes jostled for authority, the Hanseatic League created its own legal universe. The League's laws covered everything. Seriously, how wide your cartwheels could be, how much wine you could carry without a separate permit, how to weigh pepper without getting accused of fraud. There were even laws about when you were allowed to throw garbage into canals. Never during trading hours, obviously. No one wants floating turnips scaring off customers. And if you broke these rules, you didn't go to a regular court. You were tried by a merchant tribunal. Picture a room full of senior guild members, each one older and grumpier than the last, passing judgment on whether your beeswax shipment was tampered with. If you were found guilty, you might be fined, exiled, or publicly shamed, sometimes all three. In one infamous case, a merchant who sold spoiled cod was forced to walk the docks holding a fish above his head while being pelted with onions. True story? Debated, but funny either way. Now for a delightful fringe tidbit. The League's legal language was so dense and technical that scribes began using little doodles, fish, barrels, cogs, to mark categories in the margins of documents. One surviving document from Bruges has a tiny frowning herring drawn beside a fine for fraudulent fish packing. Medieval emojis, basically. And speaking of scribes, these weren't just clerks. They were trained professionals, many educated in monasteries, who could draft multilingual contracts, track debts, and manage trade disputes across 4 or 5 cities. Some of them had handwriting so fine that rival cities would actually steal scribes from each other. Imagine getting headhunted because your ampersands were spicy. But it wasn't just about law and order. The League also had a serious love affair with standardization. You couldn't have free trade without trust, and trust meant reliable weights. Consistent measures and shared definitions. A pound of wax in Reval had to be the same as a pound of wax in Cologne, or else someone was going to get very angry very fast. To ensure consistency, the League circulated official weights and measures. These were kept in locked chests and only brought out for trade checks. A traveling inspector could arrive at a merchant stall, whip out an official Hanseatic iron weight, and plop it down on your scale. If your measurements didn't match up, fines, forfeits, and sometimes having your scales publicly smashed. Brutal, but effective. Now here's your scholarly debate of the night. Did the League's rule system serve to maintain fairness across its network, or did it serve as a protectionist tool to keep outsiders out and wealth within the guild circle? Some argue that the laws were primarily defensive, meant to ensure safe and equal trade. Others think they were a velvet rope, draped around the elite, with the occasional axe for anyone who tried to sneak under it. Let's talk fines for a moment, because honestly, the League was obsessed with them. Forget jail time. Fines were the main disciplinary tool. They were tiered by offense, documented in city records, and could be paid in coin, goods, or in rare cases by public apology. One 14th century merchant was fined for attempting to bribe a harbor official with a basket of dubious apples. That's an actual phrase in the record, dubious apples. I mean, were they bad apples? Magic apples? Nobody knows, but he paid dearly. And then there were the loopholes. Oh yes, even in medieval times, people looked for wiggle room. Clever merchants figured out that they could get around certain rules by technically obeying them. For example, if a law said you couldn't sell cloth on Sunday, some merchants hired local boys to accidentally drop samples in front of customers, who might then make unsolicited offers. Ingenious? Yes. Legal? Debatable. the League tried to clamp down with increasingly specific rules. You can almost hear the frustration in some of the later ordinances. No merchant shall, under any circumstance, display wares by proxy or in direct suggestion on feast days, including but not limited to dropping, spilling, wafting, or humming near said wares. I'm not joking. The League was the original over-policer. Still, it worked by setting rules that everyone grudgingly followed. The Hanseatic League created a sense of unity across wildly different cities. A merchant could travel from London to Riga with a good chance that he'd be treated fairly, or at least predictably, at each stop. In a world where borders were flaky and kings changed their minds mid-sentence, that kind of consistency was priceless. You walk now through the Lübeck Town Hall, a towering red brick building full of arches, lanterns, and more paper than should logically exist in a time before printers. The halls are lined with records, not just of transactions, but of decisions, judgments, treaties, and, oddly, recipes. Yes, some merchant courts recorded family recipes for symbolic feasts. One involved marinating lamb in beer and wrapping it in rye dough. Another was literally called fish soup to prove a point. That one remains untranslated. Outside, a bell tolls. The city council is done for the day. You follow a few tired scribes as they make their way down a narrow alley toward the candlelit tavern. One pulls off his hat, revealing ink-stained hair. Another mutters something about contested seal rights. You leave them to their beer. As you drift through the quieting streets of Lübeck, it becomes clear. The Hanseatic League didn't conquer with armies. It conquered with contracts, with codes, clauses, fines, and footnotes, with consistency, with paperwork so ironclad it could outlast fire. And while that might sound boring, okay, it is boring, it's also kind of beautiful. Because in a time of swords and chaos, a group of merchants sat down and said, let's write our way to power. The next morning drips with drizzle as you make your way through Lübeck's port again. But this time, you're not heading toward the fish markets or the merchant hall. You're off to something stranger, quieter, more exclusive. You're going to one of the Hanseatic League's contore. What's a contor? Think of it as part embassy, part warehouse, part gentleman's club, part tax-evading storage locker. Each contor was a little island of Hanseatic law and custom nestled inside a foreign city, and it was where the real magic of the League happened. These were not just trading posts. They were fortresses of paperwork, diplomacy, and regulated gossip. And the rules inside? Oh, the rules. Your first stop, the steel yard in London. No, not a steel yard like a factory. That's just what they called it. Here in the heart of medieval London, nestled against the Thames, Hanseatic merchants set up shop in what was essentially a walled Hanse town inside another town. And the English? They had mixed feelings. You walk through the thick wooden gates and immediately feel the difference. The buildings are brick and beam, heavy and plain. There's a central courtyard, a communal hall, a chapel, and lodging stacked 2 or 3 floors high. No one's laughing here. A man sweeps the cobblestones like he's solving a personal vendetta against leaves. Another checks the seal on a barrel of flax as if it might explode. Welcome to Hansa HQ. Let's hit you with your mainstream historical fact. The steel yard was the Hanseatic League's main London contor and operated with full privileges granted by English kings. At least until the Tudors got testy. It offered storage, legal autonomy, and tax breaks for League merchants, which understandably annoyed the English locals who didn't enjoy competing with untaxed Germans, living behind fortified walls and sending all their profits home. Here's your fringe tidbit. The Hansa merchants weren't allowed to bring women into the contor. That's right, official policy, no wives, no daughters, no casual visitors. Why? Because they believed women distracted the merchants and could compromise trade negotiations. So instead, they created a famously awkward bachelor society full of middle-aged men, barrels of salted fish, and a lot of passive-aggressive parchment notes. It's like a really grim reality show called Trade or Die Alone. Each contor was governed by its own alderman, basically a merchant mayor, elected by the members for a fixed term. He was the one responsible for enforcing rules, negotiating with local authorities, and organizing banquets that probably involved too much cabbage and very little laughter. And the rules inside? Oh boy. There were curfews, bedtimes, dress codes, alcohol restrictions. If you got caught singing after curfew or drinking outside the designated hall, you'd be fined. If you brought in an outsider, even for a quick hello, you'd be reported. The Kantor was like a monastery for people who worshipped profit margins instead of saints. Now off to Bruges, where the Hanseatic Kantor was a little more colorful, though no less rule-bound. Here they called their compound the Oosterlingenhuis, literally House of the Easterners. And while the architecture was prettier, the vibe was still suspiciously dry. Imagine a Flemish villa mashed with a fortress full of quiet courtyards and echoing corridors, where the biggest scandal might be a shipment of wool that was, gasp, not perfectly dry. You hear snippets of debate in the main hall, something about whether Flemish textiles should be folded lengthwise or widthwise, real high-stakes stuff, and don't even get them started on shipping manifests. Some merchants carried them like holy books. The Bruges Kantor was known for its meticulous record-keeping. You'd find ledgers bound in iron clasps, ink mixed with crushed berries for permanence, and seals made of beeswax so pure you could still smell the honey. One merchant famously sealed every letter with a thumbprint in red ink and a tiny drawing of a fish. No one ever explained why. Your scholarly debate for this evening: were these Kantors in diplomatic enclaves or colonial impositions? Some scholars argue they allowed for peaceful, structured trade across borders. Others think they were tools of soft conquest, places where Hanseatic merchants operated with near-sovereign power, undermining local economies and exploiting legal loopholes. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. They were both sanctuaries and saboteurs. Next stop, Novgorod. Again, yes, we've been there before, but this time you see it through the lens of its infamous Kantor, the Peterhof. If Bruges was all about structure and London about discipline, Novgorod's Kantor was about survival. The Peterhof was basically a wooden fortress wrapped in suspicion. Foreigners weren't allowed out after dark. You needed permits to even talk to local traders. Every conversation was recorded. Every transaction had to be double-signed. It was like living inside a filing cabinet, and yet it thrived. The Russian fur trade was booming, and the Hanseatic League needed those pelts. So they played by the rules, however strict, however cold, however utterly exhausting. The Peterhof had its own bathhouse, its own bakery, and, according to one disgruntled merchant, rats as large as a cat and twice as bold. Each Kantor had its own flavor, shaped by the host city, but they all shared key traits: self-governance, rigid regulation, and a stunning resistance to local influence. Hansa merchants rarely adopted local customs. They spoke their own dialects, ate their own food, and paid taxes according to Hanseatic calculations, not local law. This made them alien, but also incredibly stable. And that stability? That was the secret. In a world of wars, plagues, revolts, and royal tantrums, the Kantor was a slice of predictability, a little fortress of routine in a sea of chaos. Now here's a moment of imagination. Picture this. A young merchant, barely 20, arriving at the Kantor in Bruges for the first time. He's wide-eyed, nervous, holding a shipping manifest tighter than a child clutches a blanket. He's ushered into a tiny room with a long table, 2 ink pots, and a man who hasn't smiled since 1329. He's grilled about his goods, his hometown, his ship's captain, and how many days he spent at sea. Then he's shown to a cot and told the curfew is strictly enforced. This isn't a vacation. It's initiation into a world where precision is power. Fringe tidbit number 2, the Kantors often maintained their own small militias, not for offense, but for protection. If there was unrest in the city, these quiet, paper-pushing enclaves could suddenly sprout armed guards. One London account mentions Hanseatic guards forming a shield wall during a local uprising, protecting barrels of rye like they were royalty. And one last curious fact to file away. The contours sent quarterly reports back to Lübeck, often by horseback couriers who traveled for weeks through rain, snow, and worse. These letters detailed everything: market prices, ship schedules, diplomatic tensions, gossip, suspected spies, and which baker's ride was inferior this season. No, seriously. They read like trade reports mixed with soap operas. As night falls, you find yourself in the chapel of the Bruges Contour. The candles flicker in a drafty alcove. The benches are cold, but the silence here feels sacred, not religious, but reverent. This is the church of trade, and every document, every barrel, every coin is an offering. Outside, the wind shifts. Somewhere a ship bell rings. A scribe rubs his temples by lamplight. A merchant checks his account book for the third time. The contours may have been dull, restrictive, cold, but they were the neural nodes of the League's empire, quietly pulsing with commerce held together by ink, wax, and deeply suspicious glances. You wake to the steady crash of waves and the faint cry of gulls as you find yourself aboard a Hanseatic cog, the trademark vessel of the League's trading fleet. The salty wind bites at your cheeks, and the sea spray chills your fingers, but you're warmed by the knowledge that this sturdy ship carries the lifeblood of Northern Europe's economy. The Hanseatic League's rise to power wasn't just about paperwork and merchant laws. It was about muscle, sails, and naval prowess. As you look out over the choppy Baltic Sea, imagine fleets of these cogs, wide, clumsy, but incredibly reliable vessels, plowing through the cold waters, loaded down with barrels of salted fish, bolts of cloth and timber as far as the eye can see. These ships weren't sleek or fast like Mediterranean galleys. No, they were the workhorses of the northern seas, slow but tough, with a single mast and a square sail. Their rounded hulls designed to carry heavy cargo while navigating shallow ports. Here's a straightforward historical fact. By the 14th century, the Hanseatic League had become a naval power in its own right, with fleets capable of defending trade routes and even waging war against pirates in hostile kingdoms. The League didn't just rely on good relations, it backed its commerce with armed ships and soldiers. You wander the deck, where sailors haul ropes and lash down cargo. The smell of tar and wet wood mingles with the faint odor of smoked fish from the hold. Below decks, barrels creak and shift as the ship sways on the waves. It's cramped and noisy, but every plank, nail, and rope is part of a vital economic engine. But life at sea was far from glamorous. Storms could rip sails apart and smash masts like matchsticks. Pirates, those notorious Baltic brigands, were a constant threat. They were less Hollywood swashbucklers and more merciless thieves who would burn your ship and drag you into the cold water if you gave them a chance. The League responded in kind. It hired privateers and built warships to patrol the trade routes. One famous incident involved the Battle of Helsingborg in 1362, where Hanseatic forces clashed with Danish fleets. The League's navy might not have been the largest in Europe, but it was well organized and fiercely protective of its interests. Now, here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some Hanseatic sailors believed in a rather curious form of sea magic. Before setting sail, it was customary to smear a mix of fish oil and crocodile dung on the ship's hull as a protective charm against storms and sea monsters. Whether it worked is highly doubtful, but the smell was probably enough to keep some sailors at bay. Back on deck, you spot the ship's captain, an older man with a weathered face and eyes like storm clouds. He barks orders with a voice roughened by years at sea, commanding the crew with the precision of a seasoned general. The captain's role was critical, not just for steering the ship, but for negotiating safe passage through hostile waters and ports. His knowledge of currents, winds, and coastal politics could mean the difference between profit and disaster. As the cog approaches the port of Danzig, you see the town's skyline rise in the distance, a jumble of spires, cranes, and warehouses. The harbor bustles with activity, ships unloading timber and grain, merchants shouting in multiple languages, customs officials inspecting cargo with hawk-like intensity. Historians still debate how much military power the Hanseatic League truly wielded. Some argue that the League's fleet was more defensive than offensive, primarily tasked with convoy duty and patrol. Others believe the League aggressively used its naval forces to impose embargoes, enforce trade restrictions, and even wage punitive expeditions against towns that threatened its interests. Regardless, the sea was a battlefield as much as a trade route. Onshore, the League's members fortified their trading posts and city walls. Lübeck, Hamburg, and Rostock boasted impressive fortifications that made them tough nuts to crack. The League wasn't just about commerce, it was a military alliance as well. Imagine a time when ships carried not only goods, but soldiers, knights hired by the League to defend convoys or enforce embargoes. These mercenaries were professional fighters, sometimes clad in chainmail, ready to spill blood for the security of trade. Their presence turned merchant fleets into floating fortresses, deterring would-be pirates and rival factions. You pause by the cannon on the deck. A relatively new addition in the late Middle Ages, the Hanseatic League was among the early adopters of artillery on ships. Cannons transformed naval warfare by allowing vessels to attack from a distance, breaking up enemy formations and protecting convoys more effectively. Some argue this innovation helped prolong the League's dominance well into the 15th century. There's an interesting open debate among scholars about how much the League's naval power influenced the politics of the Baltic region. Did their ships enforce peace and stability, or did they provoke conflict by monopolizing trade routes? Some claim that the League's fleet was a force for order, protecting fragile economies from chaos. Others say it was a bully on the waves, imposing its will on smaller states. As you look out over the endless expanse of gray water, the wind picks up, tugging at the sails. Seagulls circle above, and somewhere in the distance the cry of a foghorn echoes faintly. A reminder that even centuries ago the sea was a vast, unpredictable force. The sun dips low, casting long shadows over the deck. You think about the countless merchants, sailors, and soldiers who relied on these ships, how their fortunes rose and fell with the tides, how their lives were tied to the creak of wood and the snap of sails. You imagine the cargo holds, deep and dark, filled with the fruits of the League's vast network. Barrels of salted herring, bolts of cloth, stacks of wax, crates of amber, each item telling a story of distant lands, skilled hands, and the relentless push of commerce. The League's naval muscle was essential. Without it, trade routes would have been cut off. Piracy would have run rampant. And the Hanseatic League might have remained a small local alliance instead of the dominant force it became. As night falls, the ship's lanterns flicker in the salty breeze. The crew settles in, voices low, dreams of home and profit mingling with the sound of waves against the hull. You lie back on the wooden deck, staring up at the stars peeking through clouds. The sea is vast and full of mysteries, but tonight, it's also the highway of a league that built an empire on ships, salt, and sheer will. The sea breeze carries a faint, salty tang mixed with the unmistakable scent of smoked fish, tar, and the occasional waft of damp wool. You find yourself wandering once again through the maze of Lübeck's bustling port, but this time your steps take you toward the shadowy corners of merchant dealings, where whispers flow like wine and secrets are currency more valuable than gold. Welcome to the hidden world of Hanseatic espionage, monopolies, and the cloak and dagger games played behind every barrel of salted herring. If you thought the League was all about trade and regulations, think again. There was a darker, quieter side, full of secrets, spies, and strategic salt hoarding. Let's start with salt because, frankly, salt was the medieval version of oil. It preserved food, boosted flavor, and was used as currency in some places. Control the salt, and you controlled power. The Hanseatic League quickly learned this lesson and turned salt into a weapon. You walk past the Lüneburg salt mines, their entrances dark and foreboding. Here, miners risked their lives to extract the precious white gold, which was then shipped to League cities and beyond. But salt wasn't just mined and sold. It was carefully rationed, stockpiled, and sometimes deliberately withheld to manipulate markets. Here's your mainstream fact. The League held virtual monopolies over salt distribution in many regions, allowing it to drive prices and restrict supply to competitors. By coordinating salt exports and imports, the League could cripple rival cities or kingdoms by simply denying them the means to preserve their food. Now for the more shadowy stuff. Hanseatic merchants employed spies and informants across Europe. These weren't James Bond types, but rather merchants, dock workers, and even tavern keepers who kept ears open for rival plans, trade secrets, or political moves that could affect commerce. One account tells of a merchant who disguised himself as a local fisherman in Novgorod, learning secrets of rival trade routes and relaying them back to Lubeck. Another involved intercepted letters smuggled inside wax barrels. The League wasn't just a trading network, it was an intelligence operation, a fringe fact for the night. Some merchants practiced cargo camouflage, disguising valuable goods as low-value items to evade taxes or sabotage. There are tales of barrels marked as fish oil, actually containing rare spices or precious metals. Whether true or exaggerated, it shows the lengths merchants went to protect their secrets. But the secretive side of the League wasn't just about sneaky tricks. It was about protecting hard-earned monopolies. Salt, timber, wax, grain, each was fiercely guarded. If a city dared to break the League's agreed-upon trade rules or undercut prices, it faced coordinated boycotts or embargoes. In one famous incident, the League imposed an embargo on the city of Novgorod after trade disputes. The halt of Hanseatic goods led to significant economic strain, forcing Novgorod to negotiate terms favorable to the League. This wasn't just trade, it was economic warfare. Historians debate the ethics and effectiveness of these tactics. Some see the League's secretive practices as necessary for survival in a competitive and violent medieval world. Others argue they contributed to unfair monopolies that stifled local economies and innovation. Meanwhile, in the busy taverns lining Lübeck's canals, merchants exchanged more than goods. Gossip and information flowed freely, shaping alliances and rivalries. The League's power depended as much on knowing what others were up to as on their legal codes or ships. One old Hanseatic joke went something like this. What's the difference between a Hanse merchant and a cat? The cat only has 9 lives. It hints at the constant danger merchants faced, from pirates, rival cities, and even their own kind. You catch a glimpse of a merchant closing a deal in a low voice, slipping a sealed letter across the table. The contents? Likely more valuable than the barrels of wax stacked nearby. The League's combination of secrecy, enforcement, and intelligence gathering was revolutionary for its time. It allowed a network of loosely connected cities to act as a coordinated economic powerhouse across hundreds of miles. As evening descends, you stroll back through the docks, past flickering lanterns and ships bobbing gently. Somewhere, a cargo hold creaks under the weight of barrels filled with salted fish, precious salt, and secrets that have shaped the destiny of Northern Europe. You wake up to the crisp chill of dawn and find yourself wandering through the cobbled streets of one of the Hanseatic League's golden eras, a time when their power stretched across the Baltic and North Seas like a well-woven tapestry. The sun glints off the red brick buildings of Lübeck, the queen of the Hanse, and you feel the pulse of a league at its peak. When kings bowed to its influence and cities trembled before its economic might. Imagine a world where the League's control over trade routes and markets was so strong that it could effectively make or break rulers, not with armies, but with embargoes, tariffs, and sheer economic pressure. This was the age when the Hanseatic League ruled the north. Walking through the busy harbor, you see ships unloading barrels of salted herring, crates of wax, bolts of fine cloth, and sacks of grain. Merchants clad in woolen cloaks hustle to secure their goods and finalize deals before the day's trading closes. The air is thick with the smells of the sea, wood smoke, and baked bread. Here's your mainstream fact. By the late 14th century, the Hanseatic League controlled almost all maritime trade in the Baltic and significant portions of the North Sea. operating as a powerful economic coalition with over 200 member cities and towns. Their influence extended from London to Novgorod and from Bergen to Riga. The League was more than just trade. It was a political force. Through collective action, it negotiated treaties with kings and princes, secured privileges for its merchants, and wielded the threat of embargoes to enforce its will. Some rulers sought their favor desperately, while others feared their power. An intriguing fringe fact is that the League's influence was so profound that even the Teutonic Knights, a military order, had to navigate their relationship carefully, balancing martial conquest with commercial interests. The League and the Knights sometimes cooperated and at other times competed, particularly over control of the lucrative trade in the Baltic region. The streets of Lübeck bustle with activity, but beneath the surface, tensions simmer. The League's power bred envy and resistance. Rival merchants, local nobles, and emerging nation-states chafed under its dominance. Yet the League's cohesion was impressive. A network of cities with shared laws, mutual defense, and a collective will to protect their economic interests. Picture a merchant in Danzig, nervously watching news from Lübeck about a League embargo against a rival city. The merchant's fortunes rise or fall, not by battles fought with swords, but by decisions made in council halls and on trading floors. One evening, you overhear a discussion about the League's embargoes. Some merchants praise them as effective tools to maintain fair trade. Others grumble about how such tactics hurt local economies and stifle competition. The ethical debate echoes through the cobbled streets. Is the League a protector of commerce or a monopolistic cartel? As you stroll past the grand halls of Lübeck, the bricks themselves seem to hum with stories of political intrigue, economic battles, and the relentless drive for control. The League's story is one of cooperation and conflict, unity and rivalry, power wielded not with armies but with ledgers and law. The sun sets over the harbor, casting long shadows across the ship's masts. The League's reign is at its zenith, but the seeds of change are already sown. New powers rise, old alliances strain, and the tides of history begin to turn. You lie down on a bench by the water, the sounds of the bustling city fading as night envelops you. The Hanseatic League, once an unstoppable force, is still very much alive. But how long can such a vast network hold together against the currents of change? You awaken to the faint creak of wooden beams and the soft murmur of early morning voices echoing through narrow, winding streets. The Hanseatic League, once the unshakable titan of Northern Europe's trade, is starting to show its cracks beneath the cobblestones and brickwork. Today you will see how internal rivalries, shifting economies, and stubborn traditions began to erode the mighty League from within, while the world beyond its borders modernized and marched ahead. As you step out into Lübeck streets, there's a different atmosphere than before. The once booming docks feel quieter, the warehouses a bit less bustling. Merchants huddle in smaller groups, their conversations tinged with concern. The predictable rhythms of trade have begun to falter. Here's a historical fact. By the late 15th century, the Hanseatic League's dominance was challenged by the rise of powerful nation-states like Denmark, Sweden, and the emergent Dutch Republic. These new powers began building their own navies and creating centralized economies that undercut the decentralized Hanseatic model. Within the League, cracks appeared as cities vied for influence. Lübeck and Hamburg, once steadfast allies, found themselves at odds over trade routes and political strategy. Smaller cities felt marginalized, and loyalty to the League's collective faded. Some merchants grumbled that the cumbersome bureaucracy slowed decision-making, making the League sluggish in a fast-changing world. A fringe detail, some merchants resisted innovations like the new types of ships favored by rivals, like the sleeker Dutch flight. sticking instead to traditional cogs. This stubbornness may have cost them agility in both trade and warfare. Sticking to old ships in a world moving faster is like bringing a wooden cart to a chariot race. Trade routes shifted as well. The discovery of Atlantic sea routes by Portuguese and Spanish explorers pulled commerce away from the Baltic and North Seas. Goods from the East Indies and the Americas flowed through southern European ports, bypassing Hanseatic cities. The League's grip on spice and luxury goods began to loosen. Internal rivalries also played out in disputes over tariffs and privileges. Some cities began negotiating independently with foreign powers, undermining the League's collective bargaining strength. The delicate balance of mutual trust and cooperation frayed. You witness a tense meeting in a Lübeck guild hall. Representatives from various cities argue bitterly over whether to invest in new naval technology or double down on existing assets. Tempers flare, accusation of greed and short-sightedness fly. The League's decision-making, once its strength, now threatens to be its undoing. Another scholar's debate emerges. Did the Hanseatic League fail because it was too rigid, or because it was too diverse? Was its decentralized nature a strength in its rise, but a fatal weakness in its decline? Some argue that, without a central authority to enforce swift decisions, the League could not adapt. Others point to the complex web of loyalties and competing interests as the real culprit. Meanwhile, economic competition intensified. The Dutch, with their innovative ships and aggressive trade policies, expanded into Baltic markets. They brought cheaper goods, faster ships, and more modern banking systems. The Hanseatic League, clinging to tradition, struggled to keep pace. Piracy, too, made a comeback. With the League's naval power waning, Baltic pirates and privateers found opportunities to raid merchant vessels with less fear of retaliation. Merchants had to pay higher insurance or hire costly escorts, squeezing already thinning margins. You stroll through a warehouse district now less vibrant than before, passing piles of timber and wax that linger unsold. Some merchants speculate about new markets, others fear economic collapse. The old confidence that the League would always protect them is fading. A curious urban legend circulates. Some say that the League's famed legal codes are now used more for internal disputes than for enforcing trade agreements. Once a tool of unity, now a source of endless litigation and division. You pause by the city gates, gazing out at the restless waters. Ships still come and go, but the unmistakable energy of an empire in motion has dulled. The Hanseatic League is still alive, but its foundations tremble beneath the weight of change. As the sun sets, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, you feel the inevitability of transformation. The League's story is no longer one of growth, but of slow, grinding decline. Its very strengths now hampering its survival. You rest against the ancient brick walls, the cool night air, whispering tales of glory, days past and uncertain tomorrows. The morning air feels sharper today, tinged with salt and the faint tang of smoke from distant chimneys. You stand at the docks, watching as sleek, slender ships with tall masts and triangular sails cut through the waves with effortless grace. The once clunky Hanseatic cogs seem sluggish by comparison. You're witnessing the dawn of a new player, the Dutch. The Dutch merchants are getting pushy, and their rise is reshaping the power map of Northern Europe. Where the Hanseatic League once ruled unchallenged, a new contender has appeared. Fast, efficient, and hungry. Here's your historical fact. During the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Dutch shipping power expanded rapidly. Their innovative fleet ships could be built cheaply, sailed by smaller crews, and carried more cargo than Hanseatic vessels. This allowed the Dutch to undercut prices and dominate Baltic trade routes. You wander through Amsterdam's bustling harbor, where the docks teem with activity. Dutch merchants negotiate with a confidence born of innovation. They invest in joint stock companies, spreading risk among many investors. Their financial systems are evolving into early capitalism, with stock exchanges and credit instruments far more advanced than those of the Hanseatic cities. Fringe fact: some Dutch captains were rumored to have navigated the treacherous Baltic routes guided by secret maps stolen from Hanseatic archives. Whether true or not, it's a testament to the intense rivalry and espionage of the era. The Hanseatic League responds with growing alarm. Their merchants cling to old routes, old ships, and old ways. Some leaders dismiss the Dutch as upstarts, unaware that this underestimation will cost them dearly. Others recognize the threat, but are hampered by internal disputes and slow decision-making. You overhear a heated council debate in Lubeck. Some merchants call for modernization, investing in new ship designs and adopting Dutch financial techniques. Others resist, fearful of losing traditional control and skeptical of unproven methods. The divide deepens. One merchant grumbles, "Why fix what isn't broken?" while another retorts, "It is broken." We're bleeding trade to those painted sails on the horizon. The Dutch are also innovative in marketing. They establish direct trade links with the New World and Asia, bringing spices, sugar, and precious metals that the Hanseatic League struggles to access. Their aggressive expansion into fishing, shipbuilding, and financial markets threatens the very foundations of Hanseatic power. The rivalry plays out not just on the seas, but in cities and courts. Dutch merchants lobby foreign rulers for favorable trade treaties, undermine Hanseatic privileges, and open markets that once were closed. The Hanseatic League's traditional monopoly crumbles. Here's a scholarly debate. Did the Dutch rise seal the Hanseatic League's fate? Or was it merely the final chapter in a long decline? Some historians argue that the Dutch were the decisive disruptors, bringing new technology and economic models that outpaced the League. Others contend that the League's decline was inevitable due to internal weaknesses, and the Dutch simply capitalized on the opportunity. The competition isn't just economic, it's cultural. Dutch merchants pride themselves on pragmatism, innovation, and speed. Hanseatic merchants value tradition, discipline, and cautious stability. The clash is more than business. It's a battle of worldviews. You walk through a shipyard where a flight is under construction. Its sleek lines contrast starkly with the stout cogs of the past. Workers move efficiently, using new techniques to speed production and reduce costs. Nearby, a Hanseatic carpenter shakes his head, muttering about throwing away craftsmanship for cheap speed. Meanwhile, Dutch merchants pioneer insurance schemes to protect ships and cargo, spreading financial risk and encouraging more trade ventures. The League systems, by contrast, remain rigid and archaic. The tide is turning. The Dutch are not just competing. They're redefining what maritime trade means. You end the day at a tavern overlooking the harbor, nursing a mug of weak beer as you listen to merchants debate the future. Some cling to hope that the League can reform. Others admit quietly that a new era has arrived. As night descends, the lights from Dutch ships twinkle on the water, like stars fallen to sea, signaling the dawn of change. The Hanseatic League still stands, but the winds of innovation blow hard, and not always in their favor. The chill of early morning creeps into your bones as you stand on the fortified walls of a Hanseatic city, watching the horizon where the sea meets sky in a cold, gray line. You can't help but feel the weight of history pressing down, a world shifting beneath your feet. The Hanseatic League, once the unchallenged master of northern trade, is now wrestling with a relentless foe. The rise of strong nation-states and their cannonballs. The era of feudal chaos is giving way to centralized monarchies with standing armies and growing ambitions. Countries like Denmark, Sweden, and the emerging powers of Russia and Poland no longer tolerate foreign merchant leagues operating with near-sovereign privileges. The Hanseatic League, with its decentralized structure and patchwork of city alliances, finds itself increasingly vulnerable. Here's a solid historical fact. From the 15th century onward, the nation-states began consolidating power through taxation, legal reforms, and most importantly, military modernization. Cannons and gunpowder changed the game. making city walls obsolete and giving kings unprecedented power to enforce their will. This military strength was often turned against the League's autonomy. You pace along the stone battlements, the echoes of cannon fire distant but unmistakable. The League's ships, once safe behind their naval escorts, now face faster, better-armed vessels backed by royal navies. Fortified ports that used to be untouchable Hanseatic strongholds come under siege or pressure to surrender privileges. In one notable episode, the Danish king, Christopher III, forced the League to submit to his authority in the mid-15th century by blockading key ports and threatening military action. The League, for all its commercial might, had little choice but to negotiate from a position of weakness. The old balance of power, negotiations between equals crumbled. Nation-states demanded taxes, levied tariffs, and restricted trade to bolster their treasuries and armies. The League's monopoly on Baltic trade slipped through its fingers like fine sand. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some Hanseatic merchants resorted to smuggling and clandestine trade to bypass increasingly aggressive taxation and trade restrictions. Secret caches of goods hidden beneath merchant ships and coded messages passed between cities were common. It was a shadow war, economic espionage on a scale rarely recorded. But the rise of gunpowder was not just a military revolution, it symbolized the changing political landscape. The League's heavily fortified cities, with their thick brick walls and towering gates, suddenly found themselves exposed. Walls once considered impregnable crumbled under cannon fire. Fortifications had to be redesigned, costly and time-consuming, resources the League struggled to mobilize effectively. Meanwhile, monarchs invested in standing armies loyal to the crown, reducing the influence of local nobles and city councils that had once cooperated with the League. These armies could enforce royal decrees, control trade routes, and crush uprisings threatening central authority. In this shifting world, the Hanseatic League's decentralized network began to show its limits. Without a central military command or treasury, it struggled to coordinate defense or respond swiftly to threats. Individual cities faced mounting pressures alone, forced to negotiate terms that often meant sacrificing League privileges. You enter a crowded guild hall where city leaders debate these challenges. Voices rise over how to fund new defenses, whether to ally with foreign powers, or how to navigate the complicated politics of rising monarchies. Some argue for compromise, others insist on resistance at all costs. The League's legal and diplomatic tools, once so effective, now fall short against the brute force of centralized states. Treaties are broken or ignored. Embargoes fail when monarchs threaten to seize Hanseatic goods or imprison merchants. A historian's debate bubbles to the surface. Was the League doomed from the moment strong nation-states arose, or could it have adapted with reforms? Some scholars argue the League's inherent structure was incompatible with centralized power, making decline inevitable. Others believe with stronger leadership and military investment, it might have survived longer. As you walk the city walls, the air thick with salt and smoke, you glimpse a distant fleet, ships flying royal flags and bristling with cannons. The Hanseatic banners still fly proudly from towers, but the writing is on the wall, quite literally. You reflect on the League's transformation, from a loose coalition of merchant cities to a political entity grappling with a new order of power, warfare, and state control. The age of the merchant republic was giving way to the age of the nation. As dusk falls, the city lights flicker on, mingling with the stars. You sense that the League's story is entering its final chapters, marked not by triumph, but by struggle and slow concession. And yet, even in decline, the Hanseatic League's legacy burns bright, a testament to a time when commerce was king and a league of cities could bend the course of history. A heavy fog settles over the harbor as you find yourself wandering through the quiet, narrowing streets of a Hanseatic city that has seen better days. The once booming docks feel less alive, the bustle replaced by an uneasy calm. You are witnessing the slow, mournful flicker of a fading empire, the League's sad, slow exit from the stage of history. The days of grand councils, booming markets, and vast fleets have passed. The Hanseatic League still exists in name, but its influence has been chipped away by centuries of war, economic shifts, and political upheaval. Here, in these dim streets, you catch the whispers of merchants pondering what the future holds, if there is one. A historical fact to anchor your thoughts. The formal dissolution of the Hanseatic League is often marked around the mid-17th century, though some argue it lingered in various forms well into the 18th century. Its political and economic clout, however, waned long before then. As national states took over the role it once played, you stroll past weathered warehouses, their wooden beams sagging with paint peeling and moss creeping between bricks. Some buildings stand empty, their windows darkened or broken. A few stubborn merchants continue to load small cargoes, but the grand scale of commerce has diminished. In taverns, older men speak in hushed tones about the good old days when the League's ships commanded the seas and its seals carried the weight of authority. Younger merchants listen, some skeptical, others nostalgic, unsure if those days will ever return. One lingering symbol of the League's persistence is its legal framework. Even as political power faded, the Hanseatic legal code survived in local courts. It became a ghostly presence, laws that governed trade and dispute resolution long after the League's practical power had evaporated. Here's a fringe tidbit. In some northern German towns, Hanseatic legal traditions influenced local customs for centuries, shaping contracts and merchant guilds well into the modern era. In rare cases, disputes were still settled according to Hanseatic law in the 18th century. You notice the quiet decay isn't just physical. The League's spirit, the fierce cooperation and shared identity, has frayed. Some cities have turned inward, focusing on local affairs. Others seek new alliances or national integration. The League's common purpose, once so strong, has dissolved. The reasons for the decline are many and complex. The League was a coalition of cities rather than a nation, lacking centralized leadership to respond decisively to the changing geopolitical landscape. Rival powers like the Dutch and English innovated faster and adapted to new global trade routes that bypassed the Baltic. Military defeats and the rise of powerful monarchies eroded the League's territorial control and privileges. Economic competition intensified, and internal conflicts weakened unity. All these factors combined in a slow, grinding process of decline, rather than sudden collapse. You pause by the harbor, watching a small fleet of fishing boats bob in the water. Gone are the towering masts and crowded sails of the old cog fleets. The ships here are humble and local, reflecting a world turned inward. But the League's end wasn't marked by a dramatic blaze or ruinous war. Instead, it faded quietly, like a candle burning low. The League's last meetings were subdued affairs, attended by fewer cities, debating the few remaining matters of trade and protocol. Some historians describe this fading as a reluctant retirement, an empire slipping into the pages of history without fanfare, but with dignity. Others see it as a symbol of the inevitable shift from medieval trade alliances to the modern nation-state system. You find yourself reflecting on the contrast. Once, the Hanseatic League was a vibrant, sprawling network connecting hundreds of cities and towns. Now, it's a memory etched into brick facades, cobblestone alleys, and dusty ledgers. As night falls, lanterns flicker in windows, casting long shadows. Somewhere a final candle burns in a merchant's study, illuminating faded maps and ancient contracts. The League may be gone, but its legacy lingers in the stones and stories of these old cities. You awake to a quiet morning, sunlight filtering softly through leaded glass windows and casting gentle patterns across the worn wooden floors of an old Hanseatic merchant house. Though the League's power has faded into history, Its physical legacy endures in the striking architecture, enduring customs, and laws that continue to shape Northern Europe today. You wander the streets of a former Hanseatic city, perhaps Lübeck or Bremen, where the characteristic stepped gables and robust brick warehouses still rise proudly above canals that once teemed with bustling trade ships. These buildings are not merely relics, they are living monuments to an era when commerce was king, and the League's influence shaped the very fabric of urban life. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many Hanseatic cities retain their distinctive Gothic brick architecture, known as Backsteingotik, a style born of necessity and prosperity, characterized by intricate facades, narrow windows, and decorative elements that express the wealth and pride of merchant classes. You pass by a warehouse whose massive doors remain open, revealing rows of stacked barrels and crates. Though the goods inside may no longer journey across the seas, the building's design reflects the League's emphasis on storage, security, and efficiency. The docks, once crowded with cogs and sailing ships, now host modest boats, yet their configuration echoes the bustling ports of old. In the city's market square, old trade customs persist. You hear the faint echoes of ancient regulations governing weights and measures, many derived from Hanseatic laws. Local markets still observe traditional dates and fairs established centuries ago. The guilds, descendants of medieval merchant organizations, continue to influence business culture and social events. A fascinating fringe detail, some Hanseatic cities maintain ceremonial roles and festivals directly tied to the League's history, including symbolic processions, reenactments, and the preservation of medieval trade songs. These events serve not only as cultural heritage, but as reminders of a shared past that transcends modern borders. As you walk beneath towering church spires, you reflect on the League's unique blend of commerce, politics, and community. Its legacy is not just economic, but civic. The establishment of city councils, legal systems, and cooperative governance models that influenced urban development well beyond the Hanseatic world. Scholars debate the League's long-term impact on European integration. Some see it as an early model of economic union, a precursor to modern trade organizations. Others emphasize its limitations, exclusionary policies, monopolistic practices, and resistance to change that complicate its legacy. In museums and archives scattered across Northern Europe, volumes of Hanseatic records survive. Contracts, correspondence, shipping logs, and court proceedings. These documents provide invaluable insights into medieval trade, networks, legal traditions, and daily life. You visit one such archive where a fragile manuscript is carefully unrolled. Its yellowed pages describe disputes over salt shipments, elaborate rules for handling herring, and negotiations between rival cities. The meticulous detail reveals the League's commitment to order and fairness, at least among its members. Outside, the sun warms the brick streets as tourists and locals alike wander through this living history. Cafes spill onto sidewalks, blending the modern with echoes of the past. The Hanseatic spirit, resilience, cooperation, and innovation remains woven into the city's identity. As evening falls, you pause by the water's edge, where the fading light shimmers on calm canals. Reflections of gabled roofs dance on the surface, mingling past and present in a quiet, timeless moment. You realize the Hanseatic League story isn't just about rise and fall. It's about the enduring legacy left in brick, law, and culture, a testament to a unique era when cities joined forces to shape a world beyond kingdoms and crowns. You find yourself walking slowly through the quiet streets of a Hanseatic city as twilight drapes its soft, velvety hues over the rooftops and canals. The noises of the day have faded, replaced by the gentle lapping of water against stone and the faint murmur of distant voices. This is the final chapter in the long, winding story of the Hanseatic League. A story not of sudden catastrophe, but of time's quiet passage, pride, and inevitable change. The League's end did not come with the clash of swords or the roar of collapsing walls. Instead, it faded in the paperwork, treaties signed but not enforced, privileges ignored, and councils held with fewer and fewer representatives, its mighty influence reduced to a shadowy echo, a memory treasured in guild halls and the pages of dusty ledgers. The streets here still carry the legacy of those who built and sustained the League. Merchants, sailors, scribes, and craftsmen whose collective efforts shaped trade and culture across northern Europe. The sturdy brick houses with their ornate gables stand as silent witnesses to centuries of commerce and cooperation. A lingering historical truth. The League's decline extended well into the 17th and 18th centuries, with remnants of its structures and legal frameworks persisting, even as its political power waned. Some cities retained Hanseatic privileges into modern times, and the League's influence helped shape the rise of modern trade, laws, and economic alliances. You pause at a weathered plaque, marking an old merchant's house, now a museum. Inside, exhibits tell tales of distant voyages, fierce negotiations, and the ever-turning wheels of commerce. You see models of the famed cogs, maps of trade routes stretching from London to Novgorod, and records of disputes settled through Hanseatic courts. A curious fringe fact, some Hanseatic cities maintain secret archives, collections of trade secrets, contracts, and coded messages that were guarded zealously, passed down through generations. These archives occasionally surfaced centuries later, revealing insights into medieval espionage, economics, and diplomacy. As you wander back outside, the sky darkens, stars twinkling faintly above the rooftops. The calm waters reflect the city's lights, creating a mosaic of shimmering gold and shadow. There's a serenity here, a sense of closure, not of loss, but of transformation. Scholars continue to debate the Hanseatic League's ultimate significance. Was it a pioneering force for economic cooperation and urban self-governance, or a monopolistic guild that resisted progress and inclusion? The answer, as with most history, is complex. A tapestry of innovation, ambition, and human frailty. In the gentle hush of the night, you reflect on the League's journey from foggy harbors of Lübeck to the farthest trading posts. From the roar of busy markets to the quiet of fading embers. It was a network born of necessity, sustained by shared purpose, and carried forward by countless individuals whose names may be lost, but whose impact endures. Now, as you lie down to rest, the sounds of the past mingle with the stillness of the present. The Hanseatic League story fades gently into memory, its legacy woven into the bricks, the laws, and the spirit of the cities that still stand.